The day people stop believing you have power is the day they finally reveal who they really are. No one inside the Moretti estate expected that lesson to arrive on an ordinary Tuesday morning, wrapped in nothing more dramatic than a quiet breakfast announcement. For nearly 20 years, Victor Moretti had been a name that carried weight far beyond the towering iron gates of his mansion. At 43 years old, the tall, broad-shouldered man with calm brown eyes, dark slicked-back hair streaked naturally with silver, and black and gray tattoos peeking above the collar of his black shirt, rarely needed to raise his voice. His presence alone could silence an entire room. Every employee, every relative, every guest walked carefully whenever he was near, believing his fortune would last forever. But fortunes, Victor believed, were terrible judges of character. That morning, golden sunlight spilled across the polished marble floors while crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of tiny points of light across the dining room. The long dining table, usually overflowing with expensive breakfasts prepared by a full kitchen staff, looked strangely modest. A simple cup of black coffee rested beside Victor's untouched plate. Around him sat members of his household, managers, distant relatives who had grown comfortable living under his roof, and employees who had spent years calling the estate their second home. Standing quietly near the wall was Naomi Brooks, the 30-year-old black maid whose graceful posture and calm expression rarely attracted attention despite the quiet dignity she carried every single day. She wore her neatly pressed uniform with understated elegance, her deep brown skin glowing naturally beneath the morning light, her almond-shaped eyes lowered respectfully as she waited to refill coffee cups. Victor slowly placed his napkin on the table and looked at every face before speaking. His voice remained steady, almost peaceful. "Everything is gone." At first, no one reacted. Someone even chuckled softly, assuming it was another dry joke from a man known for keeping his emotions hidden. Victor continued without changing his expression. He explained that his businesses had collapsed, his accounts had been frozen, his investments had disappeared, and by the end of the week, the estate itself would likely be sold. Silence settled over the room like heavy fog. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. Eyes that once admired him instantly began measuring what little they imagined he had left. Within seconds, invisible calculations replaced loyalty. Fear quietly became distance. Sympathy never arrived. Victor noticed every flicker of disappointment, every exchanged glance, every forced expression that failed to hide private panic. He said nothing more. He simply stood, thanked everyone for listening, and walked out of the dining room with the same composed confidence he had entered with. Behind him, whispers erupted before the door had fully closed. Some questioned how quickly they should leave. Others wondered whether unpaid salaries would ever arrive. A few discussed calling lawyers before sunset. Only one person did not join the conversation. Naomi calmly lifted Victor's untouched coffee cup, prepared another fresh one exactly the way he liked it, and carried it toward his private study without hesitation, as though nothing about her responsibilities had changed. She never asked whether he was still wealthy. She never asked whether she would still receive a paycheck. She simply knocked gently on the study door, waited for permission, stepped inside, placed the warm coffee beside his desk, and offered a quiet smile that expected nothing in return. Victor looked at the steaming cup, then at the woman who had entered the room exactly as she had every morning before. For the first time that day, something almost invisible softened behind his steady eyes. Outside those walls, everyone believed Victor Moretti's empire had collapsed overnight. Inside that quiet study, however, the first answer to a question nobody knew had been asked had already revealed itself. The atmosphere inside the estate changed faster than the weather. Before noon, polished hallways that had always echoed with cheerful greetings became unusually quiet, interrupted only by hushed conversations that stopped whenever footsteps approached. Employees who had once proudly worn the Moretti family crest now glanced nervously at one another, wondering how long they should remain loyal to a man everyone believed had fallen from unimaginable wealth. The executive house manager spent nearly an hour making private phone calls behind a closed office door. The personal chef quietly searched for openings at luxury hotels across the city. Two chauffeurs began discussing opportunities with another wealthy family before lunch had even been served. Every decision was wrapped in polite language, yet the meaning was impossible to misunderstand. They were preparing their exits. Victor noticed every detail without interfering. Wearing the same tailored black suit, now somehow appearing less intimidating simply because people believed his fortune had vanished, he walked through the mansion with the same measured pace as always. The portraits decorating the walls had not changed. The marble floors still reflected the afternoon sunlight. The fountain outside continued to flow peacefully. Only human hearts had shifted. Those who had once rushed to open every door now waited for someone else to do it. Smiles became shorter. Greetings became colder. Respect quietly turned into obligation. Victor accepted every moment without protest, as though he had expected nothing different. Across the estate, Naomi continued her work exactly as she always had. She dusted the library shelves with careful hands, arranged fresh flowers in the entrance hall, folded linens with precise attention, and prepared Victor's study before sunset. She did not whisper with the others. She did not ask questions about bank accounts or properties. When another employee cautiously suggested she should begin looking for a new position before everyone else did, Naomi simply smiled politely. She thanked the woman for her concern and returned to polishing the antique wooden desk that had belonged to Victor's grandfather. Later that afternoon, she found Victor standing alone on the back terrace overlooking the gardens. The fountain sparkled beneath the fading sunlight, while the wind gently stirred the trees surrounding the estate. Without saying a word, Naomi placed a fresh cup of coffee beside him and noticed that his jacket had been lightly covered with dust after he had moved several storage boxes himself. Normally another employee would have handled such work long before he ever touched it. She quietly brushed the dust from his shoulder and straightened the collar of his shirt with calm professionalism. Victor looked at her, almost surprised that someone still treated him exactly the same. "Thank you," he said softly. Naomi answered with a gentle smile. "You are welcome, Mr. Moretti. Coffee should always be served hot." There was no pity in her voice. No hesitation. No expectation of reward. To her, kindness was not connected to someone's financial statement. It was simply part of who she chose to be. As evening settled over the estate, moving trucks quietly arrived outside neighboring properties while resignation letters appeared one by one on the manager's desk. The mansion remained as magnificent as ever, yet it somehow felt emptier with every passing hour. Victor stood by the window of his study watching familiar faces slowly erase themselves from his life. Behind him, Naomi quietly lit the reading lamp, organized tomorrow's schedule exactly as she had done every evening for years, and wished him a peaceful night before closing the door with gentle care. The house was losing people far more quickly than it had ever lost money, and Victor began to realize that the rarest form of wealth had never been stored inside any bank at all. By the third morning, the estate no longer resembled the place that had once impressed governors, business leaders, and celebrities. The silence had become almost permanent, interrupted only by the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner, the ticking of an antique grandfather clock, and the birds gathering outside the tall windows. Nearly half of the household staff had already submitted their resignations. Those who remained moved through the mansion with visible uncertainty, performing only the duties that could not be avoided. The warmth that had once filled the home had quietly disappeared, replaced by cautious distance. Victor Moretti welcomed the morning exactly as he had welcomed every other day of his adult life. He woke before sunrise, shaved carefully, adjusted the collar of his black shirt beneath his tailored black suit, and studied his reflection for only a brief moment. His calm brown eyes revealed nothing. The streaks of silver in his dark hair seemed more noticeable beneath the soft light, and the black and gray tattoos rising above his open collar remained unchanged, quiet reminders that appearances often survived long after fortunes supposedly disappeared. Instead of stepping into one of the luxury vehicles that usually waited outside, Victor walked toward an aging dark sedan parked near the service entrance. The expensive cars had been moved away the previous evening as part of the illusion everyone now believed. Several employees watched discreetly through the front windows. One whispered that it was sad. Another replied that it was inevitable. Victor heard neither comment directly, yet he recognized their expressions immediately. They were no longer looking at a respected leader. They were looking at a cautionary tale. The drive into town lasted nearly 40 minutes. For the first time in years, nobody accompanied him. No security detail followed behind. No assistant answered calls on his behalf. He parked beside a small neighborhood grocery store instead of an exclusive market that had once closed sections of its parking lot whenever he visited. Inside, nobody recognized him. He pushed a shopping cart himself, choosing ordinary bread, eggs, fresh vegetables, coffee, and soup. The cashier smiled politely without realizing she was serving one of the wealthiest men in the state. Victor thanked her, carried the grocery bags to his own car, and drove home feeling strangely lighter than he had expected. Meanwhile, Naomi had already begun cleaning the kitchen after preparing a simple breakfast for the remaining staff. She noticed immediately that several shelves looked unusually empty. Luxury ingredients had vanished, replaced by ordinary pantry items. Without hesitation, she quietly adjusted the weekly meal plan, carefully calculating how every ingredient could be used without waste. She prepared homemade soup for lunch, baked fresh bread, and arranged everything with the same care she had once given elaborate dinners served on fine china. When Victor returned carrying his own grocery bags, one young employee standing near the entrance looked away instead of offering assistance. Naomi did not hesitate. She walked directly toward him, accepted the bags with a warm smile, and said, "You should not have carried all of these by yourself, Mr. Moretti. They are heavier than they look." Victor smiled faintly. "I suppose I needed the exercise." Naomi laughed softly, a genuine laugh that had nothing to do with money or status. As she unpacked the groceries, she noticed he had chosen generic brands instead of premium labels. She never commented on the change. Instead, she complimented the fresh vegetables and remarked that they would make excellent soup for everyone still living in the house. That simple sentence lingered in Victor's mind long after she returned to the kitchen. She was not trying to impress him. She was trying to take care of a home she still considered worth protecting. Outside, more resignation letters continued to arrive. Inside, one quiet act of ordinary kindness carried more value than every promise of loyalty Victor had ever heard during the years when his wealth had seemed endless. The fourth day arrived with cold rain tapping gently against the tall windows of the estate, turning the gardens into a quiet painting of gray skies and glistening stone pathways. Rooms that once bustled with conversation now remained dark because there were no longer enough people to occupy them. Several guest suites had already been locked, and entire wings of the mansion stood untouched. Victor noticed the silence had developed its own rhythm, exposing sounds he had not heard in years: the crackling of old wooden floors, the distant hum of the heating system, and the quiet footsteps of one person who still moved through the house with purpose. Naomi began every morning exactly the same way. She opened the curtains to let natural light fill the hallways, watered the indoor plants, prepared fresh coffee, and checked every room even though many no longer had occupants. She refused to let the estate fall into neglect simply because others believed its future had disappeared. That afternoon, while organizing the linen closet, she noticed Victor coughing several times as he returned from carrying boxes out of a storage room that had once been managed by 3 employees. His calm expression never changed, but his voice sounded rougher than usual. Without mentioning it, Naomi quietly walked to the small neighborhood pharmacy after finishing her shift. She compared prices carefully before purchasing herbal tea, cough drops, and a basic bottle of cold medicine with money from her own wallet. The cashier asked whether someone at home was sick. Naomi smiled gently and answered, "Someone who has taken care of many people deserves someone to care for him too." She returned before sunset carrying the small paper bag beneath her umbrella. When Victor opened the study door, he looked surprised to see her standing there after working hours. She handed him the bag without ceremony. "I noticed your cough this afternoon. The pharmacist recommended these. They should help." Victor looked at the medicine, then at Naomi. "You did not need to spend your own money," she answered with complete sincerity. "Kindness is never an expense, Mr. Moretti. It is a choice." Before he could respond, she noticed a loose button hanging from the cuff of his black shirt. "If you do not mind, I can fix that before it falls off." Victor removed the jacket and handed it to her without a word. Naomi disappeared into the laundry room, threaded a needle, and carefully reinforced every loose button she found, smoothing the fabric afterward with the same patience her mother had taught her as a little girl. When she returned the shirt a short time later, it looked exactly the same as before except that it would last much longer. Victor quietly thanked her once again. She only smiled and reminded him to drink the tea while it was still warm. After she left, Victor remained seated beside the rain-covered window holding the untouched paper bag in his hands. No expensive gift he had ever received from influential acquaintances had carried the quiet weight of those simple items purchased with honest sacrifice. Unknown to Naomi, discreet security cameras hidden throughout the estate had captured every moment, from her walk through the rain to the pharmacy receipt she carefully folded into her pocket instead of requesting reimbursement. In another room far from the mansion, Victor's attorney reviewed the recordings without speaking, making careful notes beside the names of everyone who had abandoned the household and placing only one name under a separate heading marked with a single word written in bold letters: Trust. By the end of the first week, the mansion no longer felt like the center of an empire. It felt like a forgotten house waiting for someone to decide whether it still deserved to exist. The grand entrance that had once welcomed a steady procession of luxury vehicles now remained empty for hours at a time. The fountain continued flowing with quiet dignity, but no visitors stopped to admire it anymore. Inside, entire corridors stood silent beneath crystal chandeliers that illuminated polished floors with no footsteps to reflect. Only a handful of employees remained, and even they had begun speaking about the future as though Victor Moretti were already part of the past. Every conversation carried the same cautious distance. Nobody asked how he was sleeping. Nobody wondered whether he needed help. They only wondered how much longer they should stay before leaving became unavoidable. Victor listened without correcting anyone. Every morning he continued making his bed, organizing his own desk, and carrying small boxes from room to room as though rebuilding an ordinary life one quiet task at a time. The powerful businessman whom newspapers had once described as untouchable had become almost invisible inside his own home. Yet through every change, one small routine never disappeared. Precisely at 7:30 each morning, there was a gentle knock on his study door. Naomi entered carrying fresh coffee, greeted him with the same respectful smile, and wished him a peaceful day exactly as she had done long before anyone believed his fortune had vanished. Her voice never changed. Her posture never changed. Even the way she carefully placed the cup beside his favorite notebook remained exactly the same. One afternoon, while Victor organized old family photographs in the library, he accidentally dropped a worn leather picture frame. The glass cracked across the center. Before he could bend down, Naomi quietly picked it up, removed the broken glass with careful hands, and gently wiped the dust from the old photograph inside. It showed Victor standing beside his late parents many years earlier, long before wealth had transformed his life. Naomi looked at the smiling faces in the picture and said softly, "Some things become more valuable with time, not because they are expensive, but because they remind us who we really are." Victor looked at her for a long moment. Few people had ever spoken to him with such simple honesty. Most had always spoken to his reputation. Naomi always spoke to the man standing in front of her. That evening she prepared a modest dinner using fresh vegetables from the garden and homemade bread she had baked herself. When she served the meal, she apologized because it was much simpler than what the estate had offered in the past. Victor tasted the soup and smiled faintly. "This reminds me of dinners my mother used to make before any of this existed." Naomi smiled back with quiet relief. "Then I suppose it is exactly the right meal." As night settled over the estate, another resignation letter arrived by electronic mail. Victor read it without emotion before closing the computer. He walked to the window overlooking the dark gardens where only a few lights still glowed across the enormous property. Behind him, Naomi quietly covered the leftover soup, turned off unnecessary lights to save electricity, and wished him good night before leaving. After the front door closed, Victor remained standing in the silence, finally understanding that when comfort disappeared, gratitude often disappeared with it. Yet somehow, the one person who possessed the least inside the house continued giving the most, asking for nothing except the opportunity to do what she believed was right. Early the next morning, Victor left the estate before sunrise without telling anyone where he was going. The old sedan rolled quietly through empty streets until it stopped in front of a modest brick office building downtown where no sign carried his family name. He entered through a side entrance, and was greeted not with surprise, but with respect that had never disappeared. Waiting inside was his longtime attorney, Daniel Harper, along with 2 senior advisors who had served the Moretti family for decades. A large monitor displayed carefully organized security footage collected over the past week. Every resignation, every whispered conversation, every unopened message, every quiet act of loyalty had been preserved with precise timestamps. Victor watched in complete silence. He never interrupted the recordings. He simply observed people revealing themselves when they believed nobody important was watching. One employee could be seen removing decorative items from a storage room while claiming they were no longer needed. Another quietly contacted competitors before officially resigning. Several relatives discussed how quickly they should distance themselves from the family name. The recordings never showed anger or confrontation. They only showed choices. Then Daniel selected another folder labeled Naomi Brooks. The first video showed her carrying fresh coffee to Victor's study after everyone else had begun whispering about his downfall. The next captured her returning from the neighborhood pharmacy, carefully protecting a small paper bag from the rain beneath her umbrella. Another recording showed her repairing the loose buttons on Victor's shirt long after her workday had officially ended. Yet another revealed her quietly reducing unnecessary electricity throughout the mansion to help lower household expenses she believed could no longer be easily paid. Victor remained expressionless, but Daniel noticed his client watching those clips twice before moving forward. "She never once requested reimbursement," Daniel said quietly. "She never asked whether there would still be a paycheck. She simply continued serving the household." Victor nodded slowly. "Because she was never serving my money." Daniel closed the final folder and slid another document across the conference table. It contained every resignation, every recommendation, and every name connected to the household. Beside Naomi's name appeared a single handwritten note from Victor himself. "Trusted without condition." Across town, Naomi spent the day preparing the estate exactly as though guests might arrive at any moment. She polished the silver serving trays that almost nobody used anymore, replaced fresh flowers in the entrance hall, and carefully dusted family portraits that many others had stopped noticing years ago. While cleaning Victor's office, she found an old fountain pen resting beside a stack of unopened letters. She gently refilled the ink, tested it on a blank sheet of paper, and placed it neatly back where he always reached for it. She smiled softly, remembering how often he preferred handwriting important notes instead of sending electronic messages. She never imagined that very pen would soon sign documents changing many lives forever. Late that afternoon, Victor returned home carrying nothing except a slim leather folder. Several remaining employees barely looked up as he entered. Their attention stayed fixed on job listings displayed across their phones. Naomi met him at the front door, accepted his coat with the same quiet professionalism, and noticed he looked unusually thoughtful. "Would you like your coffee in the study or on the terrace today, Mr. Moretti?" she asked. Victor looked at her for a brief moment before answering with a calm smile that carried more warmth than it had in many days. "The terrace would be perfect, Naomi." As she walked toward the kitchen, Victor rested one hand on the leather folder containing the final phase of his plan. The answers he had spent years wondering about were no longer hidden. They had revealed themselves without pressure, without arguments, and without a single accusation. Now only one step remained before every person inside the estate would discover that the greatest test had never been about money at all. 2 days later, elegant cream-colored envelopes began arriving across the city. Former employees, distant relatives, business associates, and members of the household each received the same invitation requesting their presence at the Moretti estate for a private dinner on Saturday evening. No explanation accompanied the invitation, only a handwritten note from Victor expressing gratitude for their years of support and asking them to attend one final gathering. The response was immediate. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed hidden assets had been recovered. Others insisted Victor had negotiated a remarkable financial settlement. A few confidently claimed he was preparing to divide whatever remained of his estate before losing everything completely. The same people who had quietly disappeared only days before suddenly rearranged their schedules to ensure they would not miss the dinner. Inside the mansion, preparations began early that morning. Naomi unfolded freshly pressed table linens, polished crystal glasses until they reflected the chandeliers above, and carefully arranged white roses down the center of the long dining table. The estate looked alive again, but this time the beauty felt different. There was no extravagance for the sake of appearances. Every detail reflected quiet elegance rather than wealth. Victor walked through the dining room with his usual composed expression, observing Naomi place each setting with remarkable care. "You have prepared everything beautifully," he said. Naomi smiled gently without looking up from the final arrangement. "A home should welcome people with dignity, regardless of the circumstances." Victor nodded thoughtfully. Those simple words settled deeper than she realized. As evening approached, luxury vehicles once again filled the circular driveway. Guests stepped out wearing expensive clothing, carrying polished smiles that had been missing throughout the previous week. Conversations filled the entrance hall as though nothing uncomfortable had ever happened. Several former employees warmly greeted Victor, speaking about difficult personal circumstances that had supposedly forced their resignations. A distant cousin embraced him enthusiastically, insisting the family had never stopped believing in him. Others complimented the restored atmosphere of the estate, carefully avoiding any mention of their recent absence. Victor welcomed every guest with calm courtesy, never correcting a single story. He simply invited everyone inside. Naomi quietly greeted each arrival with the same professionalism she extended to every visitor, never showing resentment toward those who had ignored her only days earlier. While serving drinks, she noticed conversations growing increasingly confident. Guests speculated about hidden investments and unexpected recoveries, each theory becoming more optimistic than the last. Nobody noticed Victor observing them from the far end of the room with the same calm eyes that had watched every choice unfold since the beginning of the test. When the dinner bell finally rang, everyone moved toward the grand dining room. Seats had already been assigned. To the surprise of several guests, Naomi discovered a place card bearing her own name at the very end of the table. Assuming it had been placed there by mistake, she quietly approached Victor before anyone sat down. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered respectfully, "I believe there has been an error. I should be serving dinner, not sitting with the guests." Victor looked at her with quiet certainty. "There is no mistake, Naomi. Tonight, I would like you to join us." She hesitated for a moment before accepting his request with humble gratitude. Around the table, puzzled glances quietly spread from one guest to another, but no one objected aloud. Victor waited until every chair was occupied. The room gradually fell silent beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. He rested one hand on a slim leather folder beside his plate, and slowly looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes with the same calm confidence. The evening everyone believed would restore their fortunes was about to reveal something infinitely more valuable than money. Victor allowed the silence to settle over the dining room before he slowly rose from his chair. Every face turned toward him with quiet expectation. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light above, and the long polished table looked almost exactly as it had during the grand celebrations of previous years. The only difference was that tonight no one truly knew why they had been invited. Victor rested one hand on the leather folder beside his plate, and looked around the room without the slightest trace of anger. "Thank you all for coming," he began calmly. "Over the past several days, I have learned more about the people in my life than I learned during the previous 20 years. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, but nobody interrupted. Victor continued in the same measured voice. "When I announced that I had lost everything, I believed I was watching my fortune disappear. Instead, I watched illusions disappear." The room became even quieter. One former employee lowered his eyes toward the table. A distant relative forced an uncomfortable smile that quickly faded. Victor opened the leather folder and removed several neatly organized pages. Every resignation, every conversation, every decision made inside this home was carefully documented. Not to punish anyone, but to understand who remained loyal when loyalty no longer offered a reward. A nervous cough echoed briefly before disappearing into the silence. Victor did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with complete certainty. Many people believed they were walking away from a man without a future. In reality, they were walking away from their own character. No one could find words to answer him. The elegant dinner that everyone expected to celebrate renewed wealth had quietly become a mirror reflecting every choice they had made. Victor then closed the folder and looked toward Naomi. She immediately appeared uncomfortable with the attention and gently lowered her eyes. There was one person, Victor said softly, who never asked whether there would still be a salary. She never requested reimbursement for the medicine she purchased. She repaired my clothing without being asked. She reduced household expenses because she believed protecting this home was still worth her effort. She greeted me every morning with exactly the same respect whether she believed I was wealthy or completely broke. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. She had never imagined anyone had noticed those ordinary moments. Victor smiled warmly for the first time in many days. Naomi, would you please stand? She hesitated before quietly rising from her chair. Every guest turned toward her. The same woman many had barely acknowledged only a week earlier now stood at the center of the room with calm dignity. Victor reached into the folder once more and removed a sealed envelope bearing the Moretti family crest. He walked around the table himself and placed it gently into Naomi's hands. Inside this envelope is a new employment agreement, he said. Beginning today, you will no longer serve this household as a maid. You will become director of household operations for every Moretti property in the country, with a salary, benefits, and authority that reflect the integrity you have already demonstrated. Naomi looked at the envelope without opening it. Her eyes filled with emotion, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Moretti, I only tried to do my job. Victor gently shook his head. No. You protected something much greater than a job. You protected human dignity when everyone else believed it no longer mattered. Around the table, no one spoke. Some stared at their untouched plates. Others quietly reflected on the choices they wished they could now change. The magnificent dining room remained completely silent, because at that moment everyone finally understood that the greatest reward in the house had never belonged to the richest person. It belonged to the only person who had never measured another human being by the size of a bank account. For several long moments, nobody moved. The dining room remained wrapped in complete silence, as Naomi held the unopened envelope with both hands, still struggling to believe what had just happened. Around the table, the same people who had quietly abandoned Victor only days earlier now found themselves unable to meet either his eyes or hers. The chandeliers above continued casting warm light across polished silver and crystal, yet the atmosphere had completely changed. It was no longer a dinner celebrating wealth. It had become a lesson that no amount of money could purchase. Victor slowly returned to his seat before speaking once more. His voice remained calm, carrying neither bitterness nor triumph. There is one final truth all of you deserve to know. Every guest looked toward him. I never lost my fortune. A wave of stunned silence swept through the room. Several people stared at him in disbelief. Others instinctively looked toward one another, hoping someone would explain what they had just heard. Victor continued without raising his voice. Every company, every investment, every property remained exactly where it had always been. Nothing disappeared. Only the illusion changed. One former employee quietly lowered his head into his hands. A relative who had confidently spoken about standing by the family suddenly remembered the unanswered telephone calls and ignored messages from only a few days earlier. No accusation was necessary. Their own memories became the loudest judgment. Victor folded his hands together on the table. Money can purchase loyalty that lasts until the next opportunity appears. Character remains when every reason to stay has disappeared. He looked toward Naomi again. She still had not opened the envelope. Instead, she simply listened with the same quiet attention she had shown every morning while serving coffee. Naomi never knew she was being tested, Victor said. That is why her kindness had value. It was never performed for recognition. It came from who she is. Daniel Harper quietly entered the dining room carrying another folder and placed it beside Victor. Without ceremony, Victor signed several documents using the same fountain pen Naomi had thoughtfully refilled only days earlier. Daniel smiled respectfully before announcing that the Moretti companies had officially established a new employee scholarship and family assistance program under Naomi Brooks's name. The program would provide educational support, emergency financial assistance, and professional development opportunities for every household employee across every Moretti property. Naomi looked overwhelmed. Mr. Moretti, I do not deserve something like this, Victor answered with a gentle smile. You earned it long before today. You simply did not know anyone was watching. The guests remained silent. No applause filled the room. No speeches followed. The quiet itself carried greater meaning than words ever could. After dinner ended, many people left the estate more slowly than they had entered. Some offered awkward apologies. Others remained too ashamed to speak at all. Naomi stood at the front entrance thanking every guest for coming with the same grace she had shown everyone before, during, and after the test. She treated those who had ignored her with exactly the same respect she had always offered, proving once again that dignity did not depend on another person's behavior. As the final car disappeared beyond the front gates, Victor stood beside Naomi overlooking the peaceful gardens. The evening air felt lighter than it had in many years. He realized his greatest achievement had never been building an empire. It had been discovering the one person whose integrity could never be bought or frightened away. And on that quiet night, everyone who had entered the Moretti estate left carrying the same unforgettable truth. Wealth may open doors, but only character decides who deserves to remain inside. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.